Hi, a revised version here of blurb 8. A few years back, some friends and I went different ways regarding what was the genuine Word of God. They had for years been using primarily the King James Version, but were graduating, they felt, to a deeper level of discovery, or better scholarship at least, offered by Westcott and Hort, the 19th century fathers of the critical text, and popular modern versions. I was concerned and questioned the decision, but they began challenging the authority of the Textus Receptus, which, as we know, largely generated the King James Bible, citing lots of problems and failures with various authors and researchers who published it, including King James himself, oblivious of the same regarding their two newly found scholars who offered us their own version in 1881. They promoted and based theirs heavily on what they decided was an authentic 4th century Greek text known as the Codex Sinaiticus. But people now are learning that this codex was, in all probability, a forgery. Unlike its counterpart, the Codex Vaticanus, which itself has other problems, Sinaiticus was a forgery, created by a man named Constantine Simonides between 1838 and 1840, not the 4th century. I was convinced that if God wanted to communicate to us, his people, regarding what was true about origins and our origins and what he wanted of us, he was not only able to do so then, but was able to perfectly preserve and copy those thoughts over and over in uncorrupted words, often called the Word of God, down through time, in English or any other language. This so, despite all the problems that would tend to corrupt those words, given the many translations and languages they would be reproduced in through the centuries. He says so right in his word, Psalm 12, verses 6 and 7. Men, though, by nature, including the very brightest of them, are ever prone to error, trickery, and dishonesty, which is why I'm convinced they never could have managed such a feat without a higher principle working. And if that's true, that principle, in my mind, would be the omnipotent promise of God himself. For my own part, I had been so taken earlier in my life with the modern version that I bought, read, and gave copies to each of my kids and many others as well, convinced that it was easier to understand than the KJV, written and agreed upon by scholars who claimed more and better research of the originals. I got swept away in this falsehood that had begun flooding mainstream Protestant culture. The authorized King James Version, though copies were far more numerous, was being belittled and sidelined for what we were told was an older and more reliable text. This critical text has become the springboard for a plethora of modern versions, sanctioned and endorsed by most leading seminaries and religious authorities of our day. Many pastors no longer encourage attendees to bring Bibles or study the Word for themselves, and instead post verses from one modern version after another on their overhead monitors during sermons so that they don't have to explain the hundreds of contradictions and differences. Sadly, the resulting confusion that began in the late 1800s has spawned a vast apostasy among believers and been the clear handiwork of the father of lies. The authorship of the Codex Sinaiticus, we find, was heatedly exposed and debated for several years in the 1860s in London newspapers, academic journals, and church leadership conferences without ever being resolved. Eventually it died down and faded from public discussion. It's a short but fascinating chapter of biblical history. Suddenly now, over 150 years later, the debate is coming back into focus. We are talking about bedrock for the authority of Christian faith, the Bible. Whether God could and did perfectly preserve his word from corruption is the question. He says it's the foundation for our pillar and ground of truth, which for every believer makes vital the discovery of which Bible is based on what, since there can't be more than one version that's perfectly preserved. God, we are sure, doesn't intend that there be any confusion about his word, or which version it's available in. Even those who have claimed the differences are minor and negligible between the various modern versions and the one sealed by King James as the authorized 4 centuries ago are learning they are not. I'm a plain blue-collar guy, and the last thing from being a historian, but it looks to me like the cat's out of the bag. What do you think?